Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, April 25th, 2025, episode 371. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So, in August 12th, 1986, President Ronald Reagan was giving a press conference over in the Midwest somewhere. I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from the preliminary remarks that he gave before he started answering questions from the press. They used to do that. Anyway, so Reagan says, as you know, and I have been told that I do a short statement here. Before we begin, I thought I'd mention that one reason for our visit to Illinois, especially this morning at the state fair, was to bring a message to America's farmers, one of concern and hope. Amid general prosperity that has brought record employment, rising incomes, and the lowest inflation in more than 20 years, some sectors of our farm economy are hurting, and their anguish is a concern to all Americans. I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. A great many of the current problems on the farm were caused by government-imposed embargoes and inflation, not to mention government's long history of conflicting and haphazard policies. Our ultimate goal, of course, is economic independence for agriculture, and through steps like the tax reform bill, we seek to return farming to real farmers. But until we make that transition, the government must act compassionately and responsibly. In order to see farmers through these tough times, our administration has committed record amounts of assistance, spending more in this year alone than any previous administration spent during its entire tenure. No area of the budget, including defense, has grown as fast as our support for agriculture. He goes on to say that they are making decisions on grain exports, drought assistance, and price support loans. He's bailing out the farmers by buying their crops uh, at an inflated price so they don't lose too much money because the market says that the crops should be sold at a much lower price. Then he concludes his preliminary remarks by talking about giving assistance, right? That he's fighting to give assistance to, quote, freedom fighters who are trying to bring democracy to Nicaragua, who are fighting against a communist regime of the Soviet Union. The question before the Senate is, will it vote for democracy in Central America and the security of our borders, or will it vote to passively sit by while the Soviets make permanent their military beachhead on the mainland of North America? Ooh, scary stuff. Right, and given what I said over the last couple of days of how what would happen if the shoe was on the other foot, that the Russians were supplying weapons to Mexico and they were coming and bombing American targets. Well, this is not the same. However, it's something similar, and obviously the United States is reacting very strongly. So Reagan makes the joke that government doesn't really help, especially when they say, I'm here to help. And then he goes on to describe how he's going to help people. I mean, okay, so he's not really going to help people. Without really knowing exactly what's going on with the farmers in Illinois at the time in the 1980s, it's likely to be the same old problem that farmers always have. The sale of their goods are not covering the costs, the running costs, and the maintenance of the farm. And so they're going to lose the farm. Why? What would be the reason for this? Well, probably because of government subsidies of the past. In other words, government bailouts and loans and money from the government in the past is no longer enough, or they encouraged farmers to overproduce, which resulted in lower prices for the goods, and so therefore lower profits, which then sets up the next round of government help, and let's repeat. And it's sort of like our government now, the bailouts of the banks. Every time they do it, it's much, much bigger. And so that's why Reagan had to say, and this is in the 1980s. Keep in mind, this is like what, uh, 30, 40, wait, 80, 90. Yeah, this is like 30, 40 years ago, right? And it's probably a lot worse today. Okay, so these are problems that had existed a long time ago. And you might be surprised to know that it wasn't the first time, right? Obviously, because this is a cycle and it happened many, many times in the past. And probably the same exact speech was given in the past. And every single time, people said, oh, right, they did something for us. But then it means that they're going to not change any of their choices, but probably do the same mistakes, but even bigger. In other words, the farming phenomena, the farming problem phenomena, farmers in trouble phenomena has always been a problem in the United States. And it's probably because of overproduction as a result of credit expansion. So even in our history text, I should have made a note of it earlier, but there were constant farmers' movements. One was the Grange. Populist movements took its lead from farmers. How the farmers were not able to participate in a lot of the economic boom that the rest of the country was enjoying in the 1800s, right? And so they became a very big voting bloc in those particular states that were largely farming states, right? But that problem arose as a result of credit, right? That was extended because of bad banking processes, and also at the same time, increasing regulatory burdens imposed to them by the government, right? And these regulatory burdens were how they were supposed to run and manage their farm. Uh, Regulatory compliance is always going to be a large expense. Now, how much regulation there was in the 1800s, I'm not really too sure. But at the time in the 1800s, one of the big problems they had was overproduction and transport problems. It was really expensive to put their product onto trains to take it to other places, east and west. And at the same time, you had train companies have controlling various monopolies, right? Because there were so many railroad companies that the competition was really, really hard. So where there was not a lot of competition, right? How many railroad companies are going from New York to Washington, D.C.? Oh, several. And so there's a lot of competition. You can't have too high of a ticket price to ride the train because if your price was too high, they would just ride a competitor's train. And so therefore, if you're the only company that is running through a farming town, then you get to charge more because there is no competition. And as a result of that, the combination of the problems, oversupply and then high logistics, right, transportation bills, then you have this squeeze, right? A financial squeeze. And so then the government comes in and bails out the farmers because they want their votes. And by doing so, they have kicked the can down the road. And once again, we see right, so that was the mid 1800s. And then we know in the Great Depression, there was another round, a big round of bailing out farmers. And once again, in the 80s, at least three times, you had the government coming in and bailing out farmers. But it's the same problem. And they're doing the same solution. And so Reagan, on the one hand, says, "Oh yeah, yeah, government is the problem, but we're going to fix that, right? We're going to get government out of the picture." But as that transition is happening, I'm going to give you guys more money, right? More, and you're supposed to understand this as because you're economic savvy now that you're giving them more drugs to be dependent on the government. So, on the one hand, you're saying you're promising that you're going to give them independence, at the same time, getting them even more seriously hooked on easy credit, bailouts, and subsidies. And I thought it was very interesting that at the conclusion of his remarks on farming, he ends with talking about freedom fighters in Nicaragua, right? And in retrospect, I mean, probably more mature people who were in the know. I mean, I was in college, but I was clueless about world affairs, even affairs in the financial world in the United States. I was completely clueless. And so all of this was going on in Central America, and I really didn't care. So I don't blame a lot of people today not having a clue as to what's going on in the world, which is why I'm inspired to do this podcast, even though it's only a handful of people that are listening. But hopefully one day my kids will listen to this, as I said before. But now that we know, we see Ukraine, we see Israel, we see Syria, we've seen Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. We've seen what the United States has done in these places. And so we kind of know this is how they roll, right? And so in a country like Nicaragua, the US government goes in, makes deals with people, finds people who will cooperate and do what the US government tells them to do, rewards them richly, which means that they are corrupt. The people in power in a country like Nicaragua are corrupt. They are, basically impoverishing their country in return, enriching themselves through government subsidies from the United States, right? And so there's no incentive for the government to improve living conditions in their country because with what they're producing, that's what satisfies US foreign policy. And so they're going to maintain this corrupt system, which of course leads to a lot of angry people living in poverty, and so they look for solutions and alternatives. And who do they turn to but the other superpower that would be the Soviet Union at the time, right before they broke up into many little states, including Russia. And so they embrace communism because anything is better than this corrupt system that the United States has introduced and dropped on them. And so they turn to the Soviet Union after that, right? And so basically what happens is they have free elections and they elect communists, which then really upsets the United States. And they say, we have to intervene in the name of freedom, right? And so they don't say we have to bail out the corrupt government we've been propping up all of these years, which made people so angry that they elected communists. No, you're not going to say that. What you're going to say is that you're going to, uh, restore freedom and democracy in this Central American country without informing the American people that, the democracy and freedom that the government is talking about is not the kind of stuff that people in America think they enjoy, especially in the 1980s, right? And so no matter how nasty those representatives of democracy are, right? Those US backed people, the good guys in those countries are, the US is going to give them money. So in Syria, and if we just use today as an example, Syria, the US backed Al Qaeda. Yes, the people who carried out 9/11, but apparently they're good guys now, right? Even though I think, what is it? We're funding them and supporting them and propping them up in Syria and then fighting them in other places like Iraq and Libya. Oh, yeah, we're still, you know, at odds with people there. In Ukraine, we're going to support the Nazis, right? the neo-Nazi Ukrainians who wanted to exterminate all the Russian-speaking Ukrainians because they're not pure Ukrainians, right? Oh yeah, we're going to support those Nazis because Putin is worse, right? And in Israel, of course, we're going to support Zionists who hate Christians. So it's a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. It's not it's surprising that people fall for it every single time. And this is why it was really comical to me. It was funny when people talked about Russian election interference in the 2016 and the 2020 election. The US does it all the time. And as it turns out, Russia didn't really interfere in the US election like the way the United States interferes, in other elections in other countries all over the world. So when the government is going to help, it generally means they are up to no good, right? So why don't people ever learn? Well, a lot of people just really don't care. To be honest, in the 1980s, I had just finished college and I was struggling with, being Asian in the United States, right? And I had all these identity issues, which was the focus of all of my attention. And because my parents were fiscally responsible, I didn't notice all of the economic turmoil that was going on in those days. And so I'm just hoping that I am responsible enough to be able to provide the same, you know, worry-free life at the same time, though, teaching them how to read the tea leaves, as they say, read the economic trends to know, uh, which career they should pursue, which ones they should avoid. Like, don't be a humanities PhD like their dad. Anyway, but well, since governments don't learn, and there are a lot of people in society who just basically listen for the whistle, listen for their instructions to know what they should be angry about, what they should protest. Well, instead of being like all of those other people, we should put ourselves to learning. We should learn and prepare accordingly, according to our needs, according to our situation. In other words, we don't take the subsidies, we don't take loan incentives, which put us on the hook and guarantees that we're going to have a bigger problem later on. So, for example, one of the reasons why I taught in a university is so that my kids could take tuition remission instead of having to take student loans. So that was the perk that I lost when they didn't renew my contract. Also, don't rely on government programs like Social Security, right? I knew that I wasn't going to, like the dollar would probably lose most of its value by the time I came close to the age where I could collect on Social Security. And so it won't be enough for me. And so instead of relying on something like Social Security, I just basically tried to save for myself. Don't trust saving vehicles that the government makes available or even legalizes, whether it be stock market incentives or even, I would argue that crypto is on, a little bit involved with government. It didn't start that way, but now they're heavily in bed with each other. Of course, yes, you're going to miss on nominal gains. You're not going to be able to buy a yacht. You won't be able to live in that McMansion that you always wanted. You won't be able to buy those fancy cars. But when the bubble pops, you won't sweat that either. I mean, you could be like a Robert Kiyosaki who sees what's going on and then takes advantage of it and then is able to become extremely wealthy. Or you can be like me, right, who figures it out much, much later in life. But by that time, you have all of these other obligations, like ministering at a church, and I can't leave the flock, right? So you just simply have to be satisfied with being honest, living honestly, living with good principles, and teaching that principles to your children. Some can basically live honestly with a lot of money, and some people maybe not a lot of money. And I'm speaking from experience, right? But it doesn't matter because what's more important to you and the reason why you're able to do that is because you're not compromising your integrity. You're not compromising your principles, right? And so no one can come at you for the things that you believe because you're trying to be as consistent as possible. And in this way, you positively influence others. In other words, you can actually help other people. Unlike the government, who shows up and says that they're going to help you, but instead they stab you in the back. But as someone who is honest, a person who lives with integrity, who tries to figure out what is the best principle to live by, yes, you can help other people by explaining what the situation is and how and what they need to do, right? How they need to dig themselves out of that hole. It will probably be painful, but you can teach other people how they're supposed to live. So try to end it on a happy note, especially for the end of the week. And I'll talk to you guys next time.